Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, it's good to see a pretty full house. That's great. My name's John Faulkner. I'm Curator of Visual Arts at the British Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's conversation, which is one of a series of events being held in conjunction with our Moguls exhibition, which I hope you will all have seen, or if not, will plan to see. It's a wonderful treat and celebration of a vibrant and important culture. I'm not going to hold up the proceedings much, except to introduce our two guests. Michael Wood, who you may have seen at previous events, is a well-known historian, broadcaster and filmmaker, not only about India, but particular interest and speciality in Anglo-Saxon culture. But the two films which you may be familiar with is his Story of India, and one which is a great favourite of mine, In the Footsteps of Alexander the Great. Michael will be talking to our principal guest this evening, Pankaj Mishra, and the title of this evening's conversation is called The Ruins of Empire, which relates to the author's most recent book, which I'm in the middle of reading with huge interest and enthusiasm, and I think if you look at the celebratory reviews that it's had, you'll gather some of the interest it's aroused. And a little bit of controversy somewhere, because it starts to tell the stories of people who are little known in the Western narrative of imperial history, a largely celebratory narrative, and this book presents some counter-arguments to that and presents us with a range of fascinating and important figures who have been ignored or downplayed in previous history. I'm not going to say any more because I believe Michael is going to make a few introductory remarks about our guests, so I will ask you to welcome our two speakers today and hand over to Michael. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. It's a really great pleasure and a privilege to be here to welcome Pankaj tonight and to listen to him. His books and journalism, it seems to me, constitute a most powerful and eloquent commentary on our times. And if I can put it so crassly, the post-colonial or the post-imperial tradition, the dilemmas of the great traditional civilizations of Asia when faced with the impact of the West in technology and values and so on. And those are the things we'll talk about tonight. I just wanted to say one word, being a fan, as it were, that there's among Pankaj's many writings, and you may not all be familiar with them, are a trilogy of books which really should be on everybody's bookshelf, I think. An End to Suffering, which I can remember taking with me, 8 years ago, was it, Pankaj, that you published it, and reading it in India, which is one of the great modern memoirs of travel, history, contemplation, many things. Temptation of the West, a fabulous travel, political, thriller as well, actually, an extraordinary series of essays. And our main theme tonight, which John's already spoken about, The Ruins of Empire. All of these books mix autobiography and travel and history and politics and historiography too. We'll talk about that. Underpinned by rigorous historical analysis. The new book's a great work of history, it seems to me. But also, what makes them so appealing is the actual experience. They're all informed by tenacious, on-the-ground observation, the willingness to put yourself right in the middle of things and to hang out there for as long as it takes to get the kind of answers that you're looking for. But at the same time, they've all got a really deep sympathy for people, especially those downtrodden, middling sort of people who never get written about in travel books with their anxieties and their aspirations. Mr. Sharma, in Pankaj's landlord in this wonderful book, and even Rajesh, the fellow student at Benares who turns out to be a hit man for criminals and gangsters. Anyway, Hilary Mantel called called Pankaj An Intrepid, Endlessly Questioning Spirit. And the new book is an absolutely audacious historical sweep. It focuses on the period which we're all taught to see as the heyday of the Western empires, the Victorian empires, peace and prosperity and self-confidence and so on, but a time which Asian peoples experienced as catastrophe. I was reminded recently, reading a book on Victorian war poetry, that every year of Victoria's reign, 63, nearly 64 years, the Brits were fighting a war somewhere in the world. And the rediscovery of Asia over the next 100 years, as Pankaj shows in the book, is not just economic, but intellectual. That's the core of the book. And that's the template that he's offering to us all to see that history from a different viewpoint. The book has 3 great characters, mesmerizing characters that most of us perhaps were unaware of. And I'd really like to start off by asking you, Pankaj, to give us a few thumbnail portraits of these astonishing people, starting with Jamal al-Afghani.
I'll try. Well, thanks for the incredibly kind introduction, the opposite of what the hitman does. You just did. So it's nice to have you as a friend. Al-Afghani, incredibly versatile character. He was born in Iran, Shiite origin, but disguised his origins when he traveled through mostly Sunni countries, Sunni Muslim countries, and became hugely influential in most of the societies he traveled through. He was he was sort of the first activist of his time in the sense that he was the first to diagnose the incredible challenge Western imperialism, British imperialism in particular, posed to Muslim societies in South Asia and the Middle East. And he did this because he was in India soon after the suppression of the mutiny, from which we can see some poignant pictures at the exhibition in the library. And he was there immediately after that. And the lessons he drew from that experience, he amplified wherever he went, in Egypt, Turkey, Iran, of course, because people there, you have to remember, hadn't really been that exposed to imperialism, Western imperialism at that point, to the same degree as India and South Asia. So he went out there and said, look, if you don't strengthen yourselves, if you do not build strong enough institutions, if you don't educate your women, if you don't educate your citizens, you're going to suffer the same fate that I saw these poor Indians suffer in 1857. So this was a sort of basic, simple message. And then he, of course, elaborated. He spun various elaborations on what Muslims need to do. And not just Muslims. I mean, he was working with Syrian Christians from Damascus. He was working, one of his main collaborators was a Jewish Arab who he worked with also in Paris. He also spent some time in Paris, a great traveler, actually. Extremely cosmopolitan figure at a time when the word cosmopolitan hadn't really come into vogue. Traveling, being exposed to many different cultures, learning a lot, and picking up languages, making contacts with all kinds of people. But also, incredibly restless, moving from one idea to another. And he was forced to, because he was, faced with this very, this very increasingly serious threat all through the 19th century, because the Europeans were gaining and were kind of expanding so rapidly, dramatically in the second half of the 19th century, and he was witnessing all this. And so he was, at one point he was saying, let's embrace liberal constitutional democracy, Hindu-Muslim unity in India. That was one message he was amplifying in India. And then towards the end of his life, he embraced a version of what we now call pan-Islamism. Very different thing back then. So he was, constantly trying to work up a response to what do we, people in Muslim countries, people in Asian countries, need to do in order to survive with dignity in a world that is increasingly dominated by really small number of Western countries, Western European countries. This was also the message that someone like Liang Qichao, who is the second figure I talk about in the book, the sort of China's first modern intellectual, in the sense that he was the first one to start publishing, one of the first Chinese to start publishing periodicals for a mass audience, for a general audience. Start publishing history books, writing articles, educating a Chinese public that was coming into being at that time. And again, telling them that China is under threat and China is about to be subjugated. And these are the things you need to do. And this is what other countries are doing. This is the fate other countries are suffering at this point. And so he takes on, I mean, he really sort of starts to write and travel in the late, towards the end of the 19th century. Al-Afghani is dead by that time. And so all across East Asia, Liang Qichao becomes this sort of major figure, huge influence on the Chinese, next generation of Chinese intellectuals and activists. And also Al-Afghani, I forgot to mention, was a huge influence on the second and third generation of Muslim thinkers and activists. You know, the first nationalist icon of the father of the Egyptian nation was a disciple of his. Various Iranian liberals, constitutionalists were disciples of his.
Even the Iranian revolutionaries of the
Indeed,
1979
they also
claim him
exactly.
as
He's a sort of very mixed, interestingly
Yeah.
mixed legacy that
Yeah.
left-wingers in Turkey, hardline Islamists in Iran, all of them could draw, inspiration from this figure.
But Afghani is not a hardline Islamist, but he does believe that in Islam lies a source of regeneration. Does
Islam
he, Pankaj?
lies
How does he see that?
also, I think his relationship with religion, with Islam, was pragmatic. He saw Islam as a source of solidarity. You're looking at societies where there are no trade unions, there are no NGOs, there's no civil society as such. So if you want to politically organize, if you want to mobilize the masses, then the one thing that they all share, the masses, is Islam and belief in the ideals of Islam. So if you want to, have a strong political movement in those countries, it was very straightforward, very obvious to someone like Al-Afghani. Then you have to invoke Islamic notions against Western imperialism, which is not to say that you have to reject everything the West has to offer to you. He was very much in favor of learning from the West, and actually was constantly denouncing various obscurantist tendencies within Muslim societies at that time, including mullahs, and he was very much against the kind of learning that was being imparted in madrasas, for instance. He very much wanted a Western, some aspects of Western style education, particularly in the sciences and mathematics. And his speeches are full of these exhortations to the Muslims that he spoke to.
So he's situated in a different area from, post the First War of Independence, the Great Indian Rebellion. You have got a Deobandi people and so on. Some of the people the Brits arrest call themselves Talibs, don't they? Back then, they represent one Islamic reaction. He's got a pan-Islamic reaction, which is rather different. You're saying,
which is very different, and in all Muslim societies or major Muslim societies at that time, whether it's Turkey or Egypt, there's a very strong liberal tradition of people actually, diagnosing this peculiar nature of Western power and saying, well, we need to learn from the West, and we need to also strengthen ourselves in these ways, whether it's by modernizing our army, by having a constitution or having an elected parliament. All these things we have to adopt, whether it's the young Ottomans in Turkey, whether it's the young, whether it's the young Turks in Turkey later on, or the liberal constitutionists in Egypt. So I think the liberal tradition at that point is very much dominant. Of course, you have the fanatics and the fundamentalists too, people talking of jihad, but even pan-Islamism, it's not really this thing that we now associate it with, which is with Osama bin Laden. It's a completely different thing at that point. This is very much, pan-Islamism is very much a response developed in Ottoman Turkey to what they perceived quite correctly as pan-Europeanism. All the European powers pressing down very hard upon the Ottomans, and they said, well, if they can invoke racial and religious solidarity. Why can't we do the same? And mind you, at the same time, I've been reading the history of Java. People in Java back in the 1830s and 40s are beseeching the Ottoman Sultan, please save us from these Dutch imperialists. Can you do something about this? People in Xinjiang later on in the 1860s. And these appeals are finally reaching the Ottoman emperor. And that's where Al-Afghani comes in and says, well, I'm your man, I can actually create this particular unity you're looking for, Pan-Islamic, because I'm such a traveler and I have these contacts. That's towards the end of his life. So, he travels through a whole range of political tendencies and ideas in his short life, which we see, sort of manifested in different forms in over the next 100 years.
And Liang too, before we turn to your third great character in the book, Liang too was a great traveller, and all these people have seen more of the world than almost any Western intellectual of that time that you could mention, haven't they? They really
absolutely.
have.
I mean, they are very, and for that reason, they are unconventional thinkers. I mean, when we think of intellectuals, we think of people who very much confined to one place, an institution, academic institution, or library, university, and all the great figures of, for instance, modern Western intellectual tradition. You could say these are people who have spent their lives, in particular areas, and basically not been travelers, or certainly haven't derived most of their ideas through travel or through exposure to other societies. I mean, whether it's Macaulay or Hegel, spinning all these completely absurd ideas about India and China sitting in Germany, or James Mill. I mean, any number of people you can think of, very limited exposure to other societies, and
let me interrupt you and just read your wonderful epigraph on Hegel, Western views of the history of China, 1820. The history of China has shown no development, so we cannot concern ourselves with it any further. China and India, as it were, lie outside the course of world history. This is like Macaulay's announcement that one shelf of European literature was worth the whole of the literature of the subcontinent.
Exactly.
Not that he knew any of the literature of the subcontinent, but
he didn't need to.
So people like Al-Afghani and Liang are seeing the world from they're standing in a different position.
They're standing,
to
and
see
they
the
are
world.
thinking on the run. These are people under tremendous pressure because their societies are threatened, and they know that they will sink if they don't devise solutions to the in immense problems they face. So they are traveling. They're constantly comparing their societies to other societies. I mean, Liang goes to America in 1903 and has some incredible perceptions on the state of America at that time, about the state of American democracy, about the state of American capitalism, the huge inequalities he sees there, for instance, how a small percentage of people have cornered a disproportionate share of the national wealth, and the rest have been left to fend for themselves.
Yeah, what does he say? Can you remember? He doesn't he talk about 200,000 people owning? I can't remember. What it is,
owning. I mean, he also has actually some statistics. I wonder where he got them from about owning about 80% of the national wealth, which is not actually, things haven't changed much compared. But also the way American democracy works, and how it's been corroded from within by special interests, by corporate interests, by lobbyists. This is also...
things haven't changed then.
Exactly. I mean, it's really remarkable the way, we've been so accustomed to Asian societies being looked at or being judged in these kinds of harsh ways, Hegel or Macaulay, or even people traveling there and saying, and actually completely misdiagnosing. You could say so much of intellectual endeavor in the last 50 years has been aimed at removing the misconceptions created by people like Hegel and created by 19th century European thinkers about China and India. In that sense, compared to that, I mean, someone like Al-Afghani or someone like Liang was incredibly perceptive about the societies they were traveling through. But as I said, I mean, they were also, they had to, there were great, risk in getting things wrong at that point. They just had to focus very hard on. They just couldn't coast on the national power of their respective societies.
You spoke about Al-Afghani, his attitude to Islam. What's Liang's attitude towards traditional Chinese civilization, because those who follow him will just destroy it, won't they?
Yeah.
What's his take on the path China should take?
He went through several phases. You know, he was originally very much a Confucianist, brought up in the traditional Chinese system of education, and very much set on that path of joining the civil services. He was, in fact, traveling to Peking to sit for his civil service examinations when his ship was stopped by Japanese, and he and his mentor, and they both witnessed the humiliation of China by this upstart new power, Japan. And that sort of set them on this different path altogether, analyzing why is China so weak? Why have we and people like us who've been at the center of East Asia for such a long time, why are we being pushed around and bullied and humiliated in this fashion? And perhaps what we need to do is modernize the imperial system, the monarchy. So he started off very much as a kind of conservative reformer. So let's hold on to the monarchy. Let's hold on to the imperial system. Do some changes to it. Introduce a new Western style educational system. Let's do away with this old imperial system of education. This kind of bureaucracy. But the way in which China was humiliated over beginning the Boxer Rebellion, that brought home to him the possibility that something much more radical might be needed, and that we might actually have to overthrow this whole imperial system or this system of monarchy altogether, and what China needs to be is a liberal republican country. So he embraced Western ideas of democracy, Western ideas of liberalism. But then he went through another phase where he saw, and the trip to America was an eye-opener for him, thinking that liberal democracy is no good for a country like China. Liberal democracy in its own original setting in a country like America is being corrupted and corroded. And in a country like China, which needs to urgently strengthen itself and become powerful enough to face the challenge of the West, liberal democracy will drag us down. What we need is a kind of enlightened autocracy. What we need is state capitalism. We need the state to support our businessmen and to build industrial strength. So again, responding to particular situations and devising. So he became, and then subsequently he witnessed the immense slaughter of the First World War, or the after effects, and that completely broke his faith in Western ideas of science, of democracy, of liberalism. And he thought, these people who claim to be paragons of civilization, they've just ended up slaughtering each other for 4 years in a war nobody knew how to end, completely pointlessly. We have nothing to learn from them. And that our Confucian ways that talk of harmony, that talk of brotherhood, much, much better. So he retreated into a highly conservative position towards the end of his life, which is the point at which he meets and strikes a friendship with the third figure in the book, Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore, who we think of as an Indian poet, as a Bengali poet, but he was also a great thinker, a commentator, a great traveler. He traveled everywhere. I mean, there's some travels that I haven't written about in the book. He traveled to Cairo, and he met al-Afghani, his disciple, and they had an exchange of letters. He traveled to Baghdad, he traveled to Iran, he traveled to China, Japan, Java, Indonesia, everywhere. And again, assessing, these particular societies, also comparing them to India and wondering what India needs to do, again, in this world where Western-style politics, Western-style economy was held as a supreme model, as a thing that everyone should adopt. And that's where he sort of starts talking to Liang, and Liang is hugely influenced by Tagore at that point. And they both sort of start telling the Chinese, and Tagore goes on this famous visit to China in 1924, where he wants to tell the Chinese that, look, don't imitate the West. I know you've been humiliated, and I know that makes you want to develop the kind of military power that the West has accumulated. I know it makes you want to create these nation states, and to inculcate a strong sense of Chinese nationalism. But look, this is a terrible mistake you're making, because that's just going to lead to a lot of violence. And he already is seeing Japan, going down that path, and he's also telling the Japanese that, look, your attempts to imitate the West is going to end in disaster, which of course it did.
But Japan's initial astonishing success, for instance, over the Russian Empire at Tsushima in 1905, this had electrified people across Asia. I mean,
It
just
had a
take us
huge
back
sort
to
of
that moment.
galvanizing effect on
Yeah.
a range of people. In fact, the book begins with this moment in 1905 with Japan defeating Russia at the Battle of Tsushima, and the news spreads around the world, and a range of people from Gandhi, who was an unknown lawyer in South Africa at that time, to Sun Yat-sen, who happens to be in London, and Ataturk, who's just a little soldier in Damascus, a very young soldier. They all receive this news, and in far off Java, Malay Peninsula, everywhere, this news is greeted with great excitement that for the first time, a non-white country has defeated, a major kind of Western European military power. And if the Japanese can do this, if they can modernize themselves fast enough, then surely we can do the same, and we can also live with dignity in this world where we are constantly humiliated by European power. So it's a great message that sort of likely possible national regeneration, that all of these people, the Egyptian nationalists, Nehru, I forgot to mention, he's a sort of public school boy at that point. He's traveling to his public school in the UK when the news reaches him, and he's tremendously elated. So the message they took was that we can all become strong nation states like Japan, and again hold our heads up with dignity. But Tagore sees the dark side of that, and he goes around alerting people to it, that look, if you start doing this, then you're just basically going to do to your own people and to your neighbors what Western powers have been doing to you. And this is a message he sends out in Japan. He's much ridiculed. He's called the man from the lost country, the poet from the lost country. And both the Japanese and the Chinese have a very contemptuous view of India at that point. It's a completely defeated, conquered, subjugated country. They've lost their culture. The British have completely overwhelmed them. And so who are you to give us lectures about this? And also in China, when he gets there in 1924, the Communist Party has been formed, and the Chinese radicals, the second generation of Chinese thinkers and activists, who initially followed Liang, who were hugely inspired by Liang Qichao, and now they are turning their back on him. I think he's just a fuddy-duddy guy who's gone crazy, embracing Confucianism in his old age. What China needs is science, democracy. We need, have a proper political movement. We need to construct a strong nation state. So they are embarking on a different journey altogether, which will, which, as we know, goes in a very different direction altogether. So they are simply not prepared to receive or Tagore's message. So he's ridiculed, heckled, and booed. He has to cut short his trip and return to India. But he plays I think, a crucial role in the book by simply showing how so many Asian countries were, in one sense, under the pressure of events, forced to adopt certain Western techniques, whether it's the nation state. I think the nation state is the most important of them. And that experiment, that adventure, was not going to end well. The Western idea of the nation state was not suited to these multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies of Asia. That basic message, I think, remains true to this very day. And so I think he was an incredibly prescient figure in sort of seeing this very clearly.
I mean, one of the things you speak about, perhaps which links those three fascinating characters, is that all of them have a sense that in the richness of the cultures of their great civilizations to which they belong, there is a resource for remodeling the future. You don't you're not leaving that behind. Are you? But in a sense, the traumas of the 20th century perhaps suggest that some of their fondest hopes were defeated or lost, and are only now we're still living with the consequences. Do you think, Pankaj? I mean, I'm just,
No,
find
absolutely.
myself,
I mean, if you
Mao and the Iranian Revolution.
absolutely. I mean, look at the calamities in places like China. China is a very garish example of that. The kind of human costs that have been paid to make China the strong power it is today, the innumerable victims of the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, the millions of people who died in famine, all for what? To make China this strong nation state. The human costs of so many other countries have been well concealed, well suppressed, whether it's Turkey or Taiwan or South Korea or India for that matter. The immense effort and energy, the resources we've invested in the last 65 years into holding on to this territory that we know as India, holding on to these minorities and not just holding on, actually suppressing them in many instances, going to wars, building up a huge military. Look at Pakistan, same story there. When we, in our own histories, I mean, these are very old societies. The nation states of India and Pakistan are very young, but the societies are much, much older. And over centuries and centuries, we had developed resources, forms and means of coexistence. Otherwise, these societies would have perished a long time ago. Those forms of knowledge have been largely lost to us, and this is what Tagore's lament at a very early stage in this process. That look, don't give up, don't turn your back on these histories, on these traditions. What you're looking at, what you're seeking to adopt, this particular nationalism, which is so glamorous and which is so attractive because it comes to you from the West. Look at what it is doing to European powers themselves. Look at the wars they've been fighting. Look at the violence and bloodshed there. And of course, the 20th century, I mean, he died too early to see some of the more ghastly events of the bloodiest century ever. But this 20th century, fully confirmed his message in the sort of ethnic cleansings, the two world wars, and not to mention, the unaccounted for crimes of post-colonial nation states all across Asia, whether it's Indonesia or, any number of places. Just about every country, whether it's Thailand, Burma, has been struggling basically to impose this idea of the nation state upon these very old multi-ethnic societies. Everywhere, there is an ethnic or more than one insurgency or something or other going on.
How do you think that'll, it's impossible to say, isn't it? But when you look at British India, for example, and you look at that map in the kind of Murray's Guide for 1929 or something, and there's a patchwork of 675 kind of small states, large states, princedoms, a couple of them as big European countries. And you look at what you call the great disaster of partition in your book, and the still continuing struggles in different parts of the country. Any signs as to how the next phase of that will pan out? 60 years is only a short time, isn't it, from those catastrophes? Any thoughts on that legacy? Or does the past still contain clues to the future?
I probably should refrain from saying. Probably should just confine myself to providing a somewhat accurate accounting of the past.
Okay.
The future is always risky because you're always made to look foolish by what happens next. So
but there are multiple possibilities.
There are multiple possibilities, and I think so much is still in play. The fact that we have these histories, we have these archives, these memories, these traditions, and the fact that we can draw upon them anytime we want to. That we haven't actually lost sight of them. They're always there.
Well, in a moment, I'm going to throw it open to the audience because so many terrific and important ideas have come out of this already. And Just a brief sort of sum up on your three extraordinary characters. Fascinating, every one of them worth almost a feature film of their own, aren't they? I mean, one thinks of Afghani's that amazing face and those extraordinary journeys. What an extraordinary character he is. And how little we know of these people. Do you know it was the 150th anniversary of Tagore's birthday last year, and I approached the BBC to do a commemorative documentary about this fascinating figure, not about his poetry, but about his politics and his journeys. And I was told that he didn't figure enough to put on British television. Can you believe it?
That's another black mark against BBC.
It's a black mark, isn't it? You know, these are, and it only underlines, it seems to me, what you're trying to say in the book, which is a book which is also about historiography, isn't it? It's about how we have been taught to see our history. And by focusing on these three extraordinary figures, you situate yourself in another position to see these great events of history, don't you, Pankaj?
Well, I think I suppose it is. History is a way of orienting ourselves to the world we live in, and defining, finding for ourselves our place in the world, our place, our relationship with events in the past, with the political configurations in the present. And I think I've thought this for some time now, that so much of the history we are taught in our respective nation states. I grew up in India, weaned on a particular version of nationalist history, in which the Indian National Congress, the Indian nationalist movement, was the greatest thing on earth. And the British were terribly wicked, and we scored a major victory over them. Then there was this villain called Jinnah who stole Pakistan away, really sort of unpleasant figure. And then, the other history you have access to is the history, the mainstream history authored in London and New York, the sort of old and the new imperial centers. And they give you this, sort of glowing picture of how the West made the modern world, and how people really ought to be grateful to the West for being made in the image of the West. And neither of those histories really account for our place in the world. I mean, the history of the nation state, whether it's India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka, it doesn't tell you about, for instance, the links between Tagore and Liang Chichao, this whole cosmopolitan world that existed 65 years ago and had existed for centuries and centuries. You had Persians going all the way to Benares and setting up a center of Persian literary culture there, all the way down south. Indians traveling all the way to Indonesia, the courts of Java and Sumatra acquiring symbols of Sanskritic culture. All of this history is lost to us and has been lost to us in these histories of the nation state. And so I think what we need now, and I feel increasingly, are global histories that in some ways speak to where we are living in a globalized world with all these many layers of identity. Neither of us belong to one particular nation state anymore. I mean, the ways in which that was always a fiction, the ways in which our identities are infused, layered, and informed by, so many different histories. And I think that's where histories that kind of, in some sense, transcend the sort of, at least the sectarianism of the nation-state histories become so important.
Yeah, tremendous. I did an interview not long ago with Jim O'Neill, who's the BRICS guy for Goldman Sachs, who showed me on his computer their attempted reconstructions of what the world's GDP had been going back into the Renaissance period, and estimated, and it is only an estimate, that, for instance, India had at least 20% of the GDP of the world in 1600, but was 3% in 1900. And I said to him, come on, what's the future, Jim, and all that. And he said, well, of course, the pattern of history, apart from these moments where a technological leap was gained by the Atlantic seaboard countries, and of course that crucial thing of them being able to take the whole of the New World and its natural resources and dispossess its people and put their surplus people in there as well as take their resources. He said, you know, the crucial thing is population, and of course the great traditional civilizations of India and China will inevitably rise again to the position they were then. And you know, we're watching it now as here in Goldman Sachs on Fleet Street. You know, so which only underlines that this perspective you've given us, Pankaj, is just, I think, thrilling. You know, when you read the book, to rediscover the lineaments of other ways of seeing the world with such truly fascinating characters is great. So I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll throw it open to questions. Questions? Yes, gentlemen. I'll relay the question. Gentleman first on the left there. Yeah.
I have to confess I haven't read the book yet, so therefore the question is based purely on this conversation. Now the question is this: I think it's easy to become starry-eyed about the civilization histories of different countries like India and China, and assume that we can only, you know, borrow from the past, and some people eulogize it as a golden past, and therefore ignore the modern world, the technology, the military, the science and industry, all that goes with it. Now, the behavior of states is determined by the structure of international relations and how they operate. And at the time of India's independence, it was a dominance for the two superpowers, you know, with accessory power like Great Britain as a minor accessory by then. Therefore, what should a country like India do, or China for that matter, if they were not to invest in industry, in science, in technology, and inevitably military power? Because after all, it was the lack of military power and technology which led to the decline and the collapse of the Mughal Empire, as did the Ottoman Empire, as did the Manchu dynasties.
Let's put that
So
question.
the question therefore is, what is the alternative that Tagore, and presumably Pankaj, you are endorsing that, what was the alternative open to countries like India and China?
It's a very important question, because I think someone like Tagore was just beginning to witness how countries, many people in Asian societies, in order to simply survive in this world, as you say, you know, international relations count for a lot in those situations. In order to survive as, you know, functional societies, they were forced to do a lot of things that the West had done previously and adopt those models. And this is part of the whole tragedy of this history. This is part of the tragic arc of the history that even this book describes, is that you know, people were forced to constitute themselves, to organize these political movements, whether in China or India. And, you know, and there were internal debates, whether it's between Gandhi or Nehru or Gandhi and Tagore, about what shape or what direction. And these debates, by the way, happened in practically every country that was faced with this challenge from the West. But at some point, those debates were settled often by external events, by the pressure of external events. In China's case, it was 1919 and the humiliation at the Paris Peace Conference, where a generation decided enough is enough. We need to, you know, have a proper political movement and unify China through force. And that, of course, played itself out over the next few decades or so. But at the same time, I think one doesn't have to look at it, you know, as a question of either or, because there's so many other things that could have been done that were possible. There are certain, you know, ways in which you could have developed your economy. You know, the idea that industrialization was going to make you very, very powerful at that time, which was an idea embraced by practically every post-colonial country, which, you know, committed these countries with huge agrarian populations to a particular trajectory. Now, initially they adopted socialism. In recent years, in the last 20 years, they've started to embrace, you know, somewhat some forms of capitalism. But again, the trajectory remains the same: industrialization, urbanization. But when you step back, you have to recognize that large countries like India and China, or even Indonesia for that matter, cannot become carbon copies of Western European countries or the United States. The world simply doesn't have the resources to provide for the urban, consumer-oriented lifestyles of 2.6 billion people. You know, everything is against you. The maths is against you. The metrics, everything is against you. It's just not going to happen. So what people like Tagore or Liang, any number of people at that time, were basically saying was that, look, we have to devise, we have to do certain things. You know, and in the end, even someone like Gandhi, who was a great critic of Western modernity, was also a nationalist. He was also, in the end, he settled for the nation state. And there are certain things you have to do, but there are certain things you don't have to do, and certain things you can do in a certain way. So all these debates, which are impossible to summarize, you know, in a short reply, those ideas that were thrown up at that time, they are still in play, and they remind us of our contemporary predicament, which is of, you know, countries which have been set this impossible standard and constantly failing to achieve those standards, and, you know, as a result, building up a lot of political disaffection, having a lot of fundamentalist movements internally, full of disaffected, angry people who feel they're being left out, who feel they're being given a raw deal. So you have this sort of, you know, this cycle of violence, of conflict, whether it's socialism or capitalism. In some ways, you could say that, you know, last 20 years of globalization, by raising expectations, has created more scope for conflict and have actually exposed many more societies to violence and conflict by promising a lot but delivering very little. And so, you know, people like the figures I talk about were warning against that situation.
Let's take another question. Somebody put their hand up over there, didn't they? Yeah. Here, sorry, Helen.
Yes, here in Europe we see some of the previously unified countries like Spain and Italy and even the UK having increasing pressures to unravel some of that long-standing unity from internal pressures. And I wonder if you had any view of what your protagonists might have made of that.
About Europe?
Well, about the unraveling, or the pressure for unraveling some of the unified nation states that we have.
What, of Europe?
Yes.
Well, I mean, European Union is such a new idea that it's hard to, you know, think of it as something that has been existing for a long. It's such a rickety thing, as increasingly as is shown.
I wasn't very clear. I was thinking of not the EU unraveling,
Right.
but some of the individual countries like Britain.
Yes.
Spain and
Yes, I know. I see what you mean. Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, you know, I think the basic thing that you know, if you want to boil it down into something very basic and simple, what people like Liang or Tagore were warning against was that this whole idea of money making as a central concern of societies, of human society, the idea of greed being enshrined as a central principle of human societies, the idea of competition, that is going to lead to conflict, disorder, stability. This is fine. All this is okay as long as you are powerful, you're strong, and you have the entire world at your disposal, which was the case for these small societies of Western Europe when they went, what this guy was telling you, from the man who coined BRICS, Jim O'Neill, that these people got out early, conquered the world, conquered Latin America, got access to those resources, then went out and used the strength they had accumulated to subjugate other peoples, other societies, and have access to their resources. And their success was built upon that early start and early success. So we can't, these weaker societies cannot hope to emulate this whole process. I mean, it's impossible to do that because the world has already been dominated and there are no spare continents to conquer. When you look at what's happening in so many of these smaller countries that were once very powerful, is that they are relatively weaker, and they don't have the same access to resources. They don't. So the whole political philosophy, the whole worldviews that were built on the basis of imperial conquest, they prove themselves to be completely unsustainable when that basis is taken away. And so if you want to take a long-term picture, this is what is happening, is that countries that derive their power from certain advantages that they've accumulated at a certain period in history, when that power is not there, then those advantages leak away. And then you're left to fend for yourself. You're as exposed as any Asian third world society to conflict. And that's what I suspect is going to happen more and more.
The Buddha was right then.
He was.
Another question. Yes, lady there.
Could I just note down, sorry, what you were saying, is that do you believe that these Western countries, like Britain, who were once very powerful, and we still think we are very powerful, have actually faced up to the realities of globalisation, and that we are having to deal with things like the diversity in our own cultures and populations, that the countries that you were talking about have always had to live with and have had to traditionally found ways of dealing with. And is it the case that something needs to be done to ensure that we actually learn from other countries and increase the understanding of how we can actually live in a more unified and harmonious, I suppose, existence?
I'm all for
Don't
Europe
make that
learning
clear,
from
don't-
other countries. I mean, you put your finger on it. I think the fact is that Europe itself had a very long tradition of, accommodating various minorities. The Habsburg Empire is a classic example of that. And when it started to shatter, Joseph Roth, who wrote beautifully about the fading of that old order, a Jewish person who realized that although there was a lot of anti-Semitism of an old sort in the Habsburg Empire, what was going to come next was going to be much worse, and so right he was in the early 20th century. So even within Europe, the whole tradition of coexistence, of dealing with difference, cultural difference, religious difference, even here that has been lost, a great deal. And I think that's where the experience of, for instance, the Ottoman Empire or the Qing Empire, which had, it's important not to romanticize their experience, but they had devised certain means of managing, of accommodating that kind of religious, ethnic diversity. So people persecuted in Europe could flee to the Ottoman Empire and find refuge there for centuries and centuries. I think we've kind of, because we've been so focused on this history of a very small part of the world and absorbing all its lessons, whatever lessons we can get from it, we've forgotten that there are many, many other histories out there, and that this whole process of creating political institutions, of managing diversity, of dealing with economic distress, other societies have a lot of experience of that as well. So I think to basically reiterate what you implied in your question, we definitely need to learn from other societies at this point.
Yeah.
I just wanted you to elaborate a little more on the options other than that of a nation state that Tagore may have thought or talked about.
Tagore didn't really go into very specific. I mean, he was not a policymaker. Neither was he a think tank wonk. He wasn't prescribing what we should do in a particular situation. He was offering a fairly broad critique of nationalism and and what he saw as a sort of basically the idea of organizing societies so that those societies become internationally competitive and have access to the best resources and all that. He was very much against this idea that societies should be organized in that way around the idea of greed and exploitation and expansion. If one were to think of an alternative to that, any number of examples come to mind, including very recently. If one were to start citing an alternative, the autonomy principle that was signed, an agreement that was signed very recently in the Philippines between the central authority and the secessionists there, the Muslim secessionists there, which is a kind of ideal document for how so many states in Asia could conduct their domestic relations with various ethnic religious minorities, is that, here is or even Indonesia for that matter. I mean, there was a lot of violence, a lot of conflict and horrific violence, but in the end, East Timor was given independence. Aceh province, again, outstanding problems, but there are ways in which you can conceive of a more federal structure, greater autonomy, for minority-dominated regions. And there's enough compelling reason to be extremely suspicious of this old model of the centralized nation state.
I mean, the biggest is the self-interest, isn't it? Doesn't the nation state almost inevitably involve us in the destruction of the planet, the environment, and everything else? I mean, we're totally on that trajectory, aren't we, in a competitive, growth-directed global economy?
Exactly.
There's no way out on that, is
Yeah,
there? Everything shows that.
Absolutely.
So we do have to think, as Tagore and the others thought.
Decentralization, giving people more scope to devise their own economic, political solutions.
Gentleman right at the back, with your hand up, do you want to?
Sorry, could you just elaborate on why this link between the nation state and going to hell in the handcart, if you like? I mean, we have to organize our societies in some way, globally or whatever. Why is the nation state wrong in that sense?
Well, the way the figures in the book saw it, and they saw it very clearly because they could see how small number of people starting out in Western Europe had managed to conquer the world, had managed to become extremely strong by embracing the idea of the organized society. And I mean, in some sense, the French Revolution is the beginning of that. And Napoleon and then the French being so successful in dominating other societies in Europe, then universalized this model of the nation state. So everyone else in Europe starts to imitate the French and thinking their success lies in developing this model of the nation state. And they in turn become an example to a lot of people in Asia who think, well, this is the way to strength, to national strength, and to dignity, and to power. But the problem is, which it's impossible, again, to explain this in 2 minutes or 5 minutes or even 10 minutes, but the problem with the whole idea, which a lot of people pointed out, was that the whole history of the nation state is built upon endless violence and endless expansion, that it involved a lot of imperial conquest and violence, and that this model of success was built upon a lot of blood. So this is, in the end, quite unsustainable for many other societies which didn't quite have the access to resources in Latin America, in North America, in various parts of Asia. And we cannot adopt this particular model because it's completely unsuited for us. It's all right for these small predatory societies, very predatory at one point in their historical evolution, to go out and do these things and build up their strength. But it doesn't work for us. And furthermore, it is extremely tainted, this particular model, by the violence that has been committed in order to make this so successful.
Let me just ask John, have we got time for another question or two? Or? Yeah? Terrific. Gentleman in the middle has had his hand up for a while, haven't you there? Yeah.
You mentioned decentralization and federalism as potential solutions to these issues of multi-nation states, as they really are in the East. But would you not say that they're really traditionally Western solutions to Western problems?
No, I think it's a good point, because in the end, what we're doing is we're putting a Band-Aid on the problem, on the wound, which is a big one, gaping one, because what really will get us away from this whole idea and the violence it involves is a much, much, much larger shift intellectually, politically, a much larger shift than we are able to contemplate at this point. You know, to go back to the previous question, why is the nation state become, this completely demonized entity in the course of the last hour or so here? It's because, here we are witnessing the beginning of yet another scramble for Africa, yet another scramble for Latin America. I mean, don't we all feel a sense of déjà vu when we look at the headlines in the newspaper? All this has happened in the past, and it involved a lot of violence and a lot of exploitation. Maybe the violence and the exploitation won't happen the same way, but it still, requires a lot of people to be exploited, a lot of people to be pushed down, a lot of people to be suppressed before some people can become prosperous and successful. And so in order to completely move away from that, we'll have to have a larger shift, and that's beyond, that's, entering a realm of speculation at this point. But these were some of the things people like Tagore and Liang were talking about. What do we need? Here we are, an agrarian society. What are our needs? How does one define economic growth? These are questions now being taken up, of course, as economic growth is sort of declining in many countries. People are beginning to talk of zero economic growth, new indexes of happiness. How do we measure contentment, human contentment? Maybe it's not to be found in GDP growth. A lot of our orthodoxies are being dismantled at this point, but these people were saying this very early on, were questioning this whole particular model. Now, if you want to shift from that, then one has to make that larger shift and not just talk about, you're right, not just talk about federalism and autonomy.
There's a book called How Much Is Enough, which is on everybody's Christmas recommendations in the Sunday newspapers, isn't there? These are interesting. Gentleman there. Yeah.
Parallel to the travel of these fascinating characters, and given that the pre-West empires were based on land conquest, and then the post-one, the Western ones are because of the navies, the supremacy of the navy. You describe in your book that the Chinese had built a navy which was colossal compared to, and that was destroyed, the navy. How do you extrapolate the fact that the navies are trying to expand the range of China and relatively of India also?
Today? You mean, sorry, I didn't get the last bit.
In your book, you describe how once China was the greatest navy, which was then destroyed by the Chinese emperor.
Well,
Compared to that, the Western navies were very small, and the West has since expanded because of the navy. Supremacy, global supremacy is because of navy. And now China is trying to expand its navy. And of course, American supremacy is due to basically its navy also.
yes, well, the Chinese were playing, they were not interested in, expansion at that point where they had this navy, and Chinese sailors could travel very far down deep into the Persian Gulf. But they were not interested in an empire. They were not interested in overseas conquest at that time. And most of their trade was conducted over land. So they did not invest in a massive navy. and at some point, decided to basically completely shut off any kind of naval exploration. Although, mind you, a lot of Chinese still went out and traded, and overseas Chinese communities expanded all across Southeast Asia. So, all of that went on. But the official line was that we don't do these things. And then, of course, the Europeans arrived, the Portuguese, and put these new technologies of Europe to new uses altogether. I mean, the Chinese had also made massive advances in, all kinds of scientific advances that had been made in China. But it was the Europeans who put them to a new use altogether, using them, for instance, superior armaments, and using them in actual wars against many of the Asian peoples they encountered. So they were very quickly successful and were able to beat back any kind of domestic challenge to them in these places.
It's interesting, isn't it? Do you remember there was an advert for McDonnell Douglas, wasn't there? A full-page advert in one of the Times or whenever it was back in the 70s, which said that in 1422, 1433, whenever it was, the Chinese stopped their voyages and dismantled their fleets. This would be like stopping at Apollo 8 or something like that, and it was a paean to Western inventiveness and to the Chinese closing down their view of the world, if you like. But I think most writers on this, and Theodore de Barry wrote an absolutely brilliant series of essays on this, was that the Chinese bureaucrats and thinkers, having spent, I think there were 5 or 7 major voyages, weren't there? The biggest of them with 27,000 men on board and huge ships. And they went down as far as East Africa, that they had no intention of conquering other nations. They were interested in showing the flag and obviously extending their rule over peoples of Chinese origin on the fringes of China. But otherwise, they really were, showing the flag and bringing exotica back to Beijing. But they simply stopped those voyages and broke up those huge ships and even destroyed the logbooks because they deemed the true goal of their government was to cultivate the life of the nation within the borders of Zhongguo. That was it. So it wasn't their business to go sailing off and doing those things. So they simply put a stop to it all. So it is different from modern navies and military expansiveness, isn't it? Pardon?
Well,
not the same. Well, I mean, to the degree that they're going off to East Africa and impressing people, but they weren't taking giraffes back to Beijing. But it's not quite the same as buying up the natural resources of entire countries, is it? One more, time for one more? One more. Lady there. I'll relay your question. Oh, we've got the microphone there. Yep.
Where were your main resources for your sources for your research, and in what languages?
Mostly English, and all over. I mean, I kind of read completely randomly because very few models for a book like this, and I had a kind of freedom which was both liberating but also oppressive in the sense that there were few models, but at the same time I could travel across disciplines which, for instance, a trained academic would find it hard to do because you have to satisfy different protocols, linguistic, do a lot of work in one area for a long time before you venture out into another. As an amateur, I could happily disregard those protocols and just do my own thing and read randomly. I think of myself as a maker of narratives, and that helped me write this book. I did not for a moment think of myself as a historian. I think it would be presumptuous to do that. I thought of myself as putting together these stories, drawing from whatever source I could find, wherever. And
there's a very helpful bibliographical essay at the back, actually, for all of us who are, excited by these tales and you want to look elsewhere. I knew some of Nicky Keddy's books on Persian culture, but I hadn't realised she'd written a political biography of Afghani himself.
Oh, I heard
you
from
know.
her. She was very pleased.
Yeah,
that,
you know, so these like all really fascinating books, it just sparks you off wanting to know more, and that's great, isn't it? Shall we? Well, I should call a halt. But,
Thank you, Michael and Pankaj. I'm sure that raised many more questions than can be answered, but it's wonderful to have a book that shifts the focus both geographically, intellectually, and culturally in looking at history of imperialism. And I would echo your remarks about the bibliographical essay. I see in that you have John Gray's After Tamerlane, which is, I shouldn't plug another author's books today, but that is another great work where the cultural focus is shifted, and I think it's quite an exciting period of history to live in, to be starting to look at it not from the very selfish Western perspective. So I believe there are copies of the book for sale outside, and if I could just bring this part of the proceedings to a close and ask you once more to thank Michael and Pankaj for their discussion tonight. Thank you.